The world, you must understand, had already decided who Prudence Alloway was. She was a line item in a ledger of familial obligation, a chair in a corner that no one was expected to sit in, a pair of capable hands that were always busy mending the finery of others. She was a poor relation, and in the grand, cold theatre of London society, a poor relation with a quiet face, and no dowry, was a piece of scenery, not an actor. Her aunt, Lady Tilson, made certain she never forgot it. The reminder came in the weight of the mending basket, in the chill of the dismissive glance, in the way conversations would halt when she entered a room and resume a beat later as if a servant had merely passed through. Tonight, the reminder was a needle, sharp and precise, and the shimmer of her cousin Claraya's ball gown spread across her lap. The silk, the color of a blush rose, was a world away from the plain gray wool of her own dress. "A little faster, Prudence, if you please, Clara," sighed from the chaise lounge, where she was practicing a look of languid boredom she hoped would captivate a viscount. "The Duke of Ravenshaw is expected tonight. I cannot be seen with a loose flounce." Prudence did not look up. She kept her eyes on the tiny, almost invisible stitches she was making along the hem. A loose thread had been discovered, a catastrophe of the highest order, and as always, the crisis had landed in her lap. "It will be secure, Clara. It had better be," her aunt added, her voice like the snap of a fan. Lady Tilson sat by the fire, her posture a rigid testament to her own importance. "The Duke is the most significant man to grace this house, since your late uncle lost it all at cards. His notice could mean everything for Clara. For this family, for the family." The phrase was a familiar weight. Prudence was part of the family only when a sacrifice was required. She was a Tilson when it came to unpaid labor, but an Allaway daughter of a disgraced scholar who had died, leaving behind nothing but debts and whispered scandals whenever status was measured. She finished the stitch, knotted the thread, and clipped it with a small pair of silver scissors. She smoothed the fabric, the silk cool and lifeless under her fingers. It is done." Clara bounded over, inspecting the work with a critical eye. "Oh well, I suppose it will have to do." She held the gown up to herself, preening before the long mirror. Do you think the Duke will dance with me?" "Mamma, he will, if you remember, not to speak of anything of substance," Lady Tilson said crisply. "Men like the Duke of Ravenshaw do not desire opinions from young ladies. They desire beauty and deference." Prudence gathered the stray threads, her movements economical and silent. She had learned long ago that the key to survival in this house was to take up as little space as possible, to make as little sound as possible. She was an expert in the art of being overlooked. A commotion in the hall announced the arrival of guests. Clara squealed, a sound of pure, unfiltered ambition, and hurried from the room, her mother following like a general deploying her prize cavalry. Prudence was left alone with the scent of rosewater and the faint, lingering warmth from the fire. She moved to the drawing-room door, cracking it just enough to see the entrance hall below, and there he was. The Duke of Ravenshaw, Lucius. He was not what she had expected. The whispers had painted him as a figure of severe, almost mythical, coldness. A man frozen in grief since the death of his wife a year prior, his heart locked away in the silent, shuttered mausoleum of his London townhouse. But the man handing his coat to the footman was simply a still. He possessed a stillness that was not cold so much as it was immensely contained. He was tall, with dark hair that fell across his brow, and a face that looked as though it had been carved from some hard, unforgiving stone and then left out in the rain. Grief had softened the edges, but not the structure. He noticed things. That was the first true thing she understood about him. While her aunt simpered and Clara presented herself like a prize bloom, his eyes swept the hall. He noticed the slight tremble in the footman's hand as he took his coat. He noticed a single wilting flower in the grand arrangement on the console table. He noticed the way Lady Tilsona's smile did not quite reach her eyes. His gaze was not judgmental, it was merely a comprehensive. He was a man who took in the whole of a room, not just the parts that were presented to him. And then, for a heart-stopping beat, his eyes lifted. They passed over the glittering chandelier, the portraits of Tilson ancestors, and landed on the crack in the drawing-room door. On her, Prudence froze, caught in the act of spying. She expected a frown, a look of dismissal. Instead, his expression remained unchanged, but she felt the weight of his attention, a focused, analytical pressure. It was as if he were cataloging her, another detail in the room, the poor relation, hiding in the shadows. She pulled back instantly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pressed her back to the cool wood of the door, her breath held tight in her chest. Men do not always care to be seen. But dukes, she was learning, were accustomed to doing all the seeing themselves. She spent the rest of the evening in the quiet solitude of the upstairs rooms. The distant strains of the string quartet, a constant reminder of the world she was not a part of. She heard Clara's triumphant return, hours later, babbling about how the Duke had been civil, if reserved. He had not danced with her. He had not, in fact, danced with anyone. He had stood near the fireplace for an hour, spoken in low tones to a handful of men, and then departed as quietly as he had arrived. The next morning a note arrived. It was addressed not to Lady Tilson, nor to Clara, but to Miss Prudence Alloway. Her aunt snatched it from the salver before Prudence could even reach for it. The wax seal, bearing the crest of a raven in flight, was broken with a flick of a sharp fingernail. Lady Tilson's eyes scanned the brief masculine script, her expression shifting from confusion to outrage. What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, thrusting the page at Prudence. The Duke of Ravenshaw requests your presence? At his home? At 10 o'clock this morning? It is improper. It is absurd." Clara peered over her shoulder. He wants to see Prudence? But why? He barely looked at her. But he had looked at her. And the Duke of Ravenshaw, it seemed, did not forget the details he collected. Prudence took the note. The paper was thick, expensive. The message was spare, direct, and stripped of all pleasantry. It was not an invitation. It was a summons. "I don't know why," Prudence said, her voice quiet, but a strange, unfamiliar flicker of something, and not hope, but a kind of defiant curiosity stirred within her. For the first time in years, someone had looked past the mending basket and seen her. "You will not go?" "Of course," a Lady Tilson declared. "It would be a scandal. What could he possibly want with you?" But the Duke was a duke, and a summons from a man of his station was not easily ignored, even by a woman of Lady Tilsona's formidable self-regard. After a brief, furious argument, it was decided that Prudence would go, but her aunt would accompany her, a chaperone to guard against whatever impropriety a grieving eccentric duke might have in mind. At precisely 10 o'clock, their carriage pulled up before Ravenshaw House. It was a monolith of pale stone on a fashionable London square, but it felt asleep. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn tight against the morning sun. A single footman opened the door, his movements slow, as if he were wading through water. The air inside was cold, carrying the scent of dust and beeswax and something else, of the stale, breathless smell of a place where no one had laughed in a very long time. It was a house holding its breath. They were shown into a library, where every surface was covered in a thin veil of dust. The fire in the grate was unlit. The Duke stood by a window, his back to them, looking out at the grey London sky. Your Grace," Lady Tilson began, her voice sharp with suspicion. He turned slowly. In the flat morning light, he looked tired. The lines around his eyes were deeper than she had remembered. "Lady Tilson, thank you for coming. I will not keep you long. I wish to speak with your niece." Alone. The effrontery of it stole her aunt's breath. "I will do no such thing." "The very idea, I assure you, madam. My intentions are entirely practical," he said, his voice low and devoid of warmth. "This is not a social call. It is a matter of business. He gestured to a chair. You may wait here. The footman will bring you tea." It was a dismissal, polite and utterly immovable. Lady Tilson sputtered, but the Duca's gaze was like granite. She sank into the chair, defeated and furious. Prudence followed him from the room, her heart a nervous drum against her ribs. He led her not to a formal drawing room, but up a grand sweeping staircase, its runner worn thin in the center. He did not speak. The silence in the house was profound, broken only by the sound of their footsteps on the marble. He stopped before a set of carved wooden doors. My daughter Cecily is in here," he said, his voice softer now. She has not spoken more than a handful of words since last year. The finest doctors have seen her. Governesses have been hired and have fled. They try to force her to jolly her along. They fill the silence with noise. They do not understand." He paused, his hand resting on the doorknob. "Last night, I watched you. Your family, they are not quiet people. And yet, you have learned to inhabit the silence, to exist within it without trying to conquer it." He opened the door. The room was a nursery, but it felt like a shrine. The furniture was draped in white cloths. The air was still. A little girl with dark hair, like her father is, sat on the floor, not playing, but simply holding a small, silver-backed brush. She did not look up when they entered. Her stillness was a mirror of her father's, but hers was born of fragility, not control. Prudence felt a pang in her chest, a deep, aching sympathy for this small, lost soul. This was not a stubborn child. This was a child drowning in a sea of grief. No one had taught her how to navigate. The Duke watched Prudence, his gaze intense. He was not looking at her as a woman. He was looking at her as a tool, a key he hoped might fit a lock no one else had been able to turn. "I need a companion for her," he said, his voice a low murmur. Someone who will not overwhelm her. Someone patient. I will pay you a generous salary. You will have your own rooms. You will answer to no one but me." It was an escape, a life raft thrown into the churning, miserable sea of her existence at the Tilsonza. A chance to have a purpose, a room of her own, a wage. Any sensible woman would have wept with gratitude. But Prudence looked at the silent child, at the cold, grieving house, at the desperate hope warring with despair in the Duca's eyes. This was not a simple position. It was a quagmire of sorrow, and he was asking her to walk into it. A poor, gentle woman with opinions is a luxury no household can afford. Her aunt's words echoed in her mind. But she was no longer in her aunt's household. "Before I answer," she said, her voice steady and clear, surprising even herself, "you will tell me the truth, all of it. I do not bargain with half a story. What does your daughter need protecting from?" The Duca's eyebrows drew together. He had expected gratitude, not questions. He had expected a hired hand, not a partner in the truth. For a long moment he simply studied her, his head tilted. He saw the frayed cuff of her gray dress, the quiet determination in her eyes, the way she stood her ground without a trace of defiance. She was not fighting him. She was simply refusing to be a fool. A slow, strange expression crossed his face. It was not a smile, but the ghost of one. "Respect, very well," he said, and the word was a concession, a door creaking open. My late wife's sister, Lady Honoria Vane, believes she is the rightful guardian of this house's grief. She smothers Cecily with it. She polices my mourning. She has a influence. If I do not establish a stable, respectable household, by the time the trustees meet at the end of the season, she may petition for custody." The stakes were suddenly immense. This was not just about a silent child. It was about a war for her future. "A companion will not be enough," Prudence said, the pieces clicking into place. "Lady Honoria will dismiss a companion as a servant. You need more than a stable household. You need a duchess." The words hung in the cold air between them. It was a breathtakingly audacious statement. He stared at her, and the silence stretched, thick and heavy. She had ruined her one chance of escape. But Lucius, Duke of Ravenshaw, had inherited more debts of feeling than of money, and had discharged both badly. He recognized a sound valuation when he heard one. Yes, he said, his voice flat. I do. He met her gaze, his own dark and unreadable. I am proposing a marriage of convenience, Miss Alloway, a contract. You would be the Duchess of Ravenshaw, in exchange for providing my daughter with a mother and my house with a respectable mistress. You would have security, a title and a fortune that would make your aunt weep with envy. There would be no romantic expectations. It would be a partnership, a business arrangement. I need a wife before the season ends. You need a home. He laid it out like a set of architectural plans, cold, practical, and built for purpose, not for comfort. He was offering her the world, but he was making it clear that the world did not include his heart. Prudence looked from the powerful, lonely man to the small, silent child. She saw the shape of their shared prison of grief. He was offering her a cage of her own, albeit a gilded one. But in this cage she might have the power to open a window. This was her moment. She could accept gratefully the poor relation given an unimaginable prize. Or she could be the woman he had first glimpsed in the shadow, the one who understood the value of silence, and of her own terms. I will accept, she said, her voice ringing with a clarity she had not known she possessed. On 3 conditions. Lucius blinked. He was a duke. Men agreed to his conditions. They did not set their own. Go on first, she said. I will have absolute authority over this nursery, and this child's well-being. No one, not even you, and especially not Lady Honoria, will interfere without my consent. He gave a curt nod. Agreed. A second, your late wife's memory will be honored, not erased. This house feels like a tomb. A child cannot heal in a tomb. We will let the light in. But we will not pretend the darkness was never there. Her portrait will remain. Her favorite music will be played. If Cecily wishes it, I will not be a replacement. I will be an addition. Something flickered in his eye, a flicker of pain, but also of profound relief. He had been trying to protect his daughter by burying the past, and had only succeeded in burying her with it. Agreed? He said, his voice rough. And third, Prudence said, taking a breath, I will not be treated as hired help wearing a duchess's coronet. I will not be a ghost in your house, ignored until a hostess is required. We will be partners, as you said. That means we speak the truth to one another, always. Even when it is difficult. I will not be scenery, was what she meant. You will see me. He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on her face. He was seeing her now, not as a solution to his problem, but as a person, a woman of unexpected substance and steel. A woman who had lived her life in the margins and had somehow forged an unshakable sense of her own worth. He had come looking for a quiet, pliable governess and had found a quiet, unpliable strategist. You drive a hard bargain, Miss Alloway, he said, and for the first time, the corner of his mouth tilted in something that was undeniably a smile. It was a small, rusty thing, as if the muscles had forgotten how. I have learned the value of a good contract, Your Grace, she replied. Lucius, he corrected her quietly. If we are to be partners, you had best use my name. Lucius, she repeated. The name felt strange and solid on her tongue. And you must call me Prudence. A Prudence, he said, and in the cold, silent nursery, something shifted. A bargain had been struck. A contract had been signed in words instead of ink. And 2 lonely, grieving people and 1 silent child had just taken the first terrifying step toward an unknown future. As they left the nursery, Prudence glanced back. Cecily had not moved, but her head was tilted, and her dark, watchful eyes were following them. The frost on the window pane of her small world had just begun to crack. But men are slow, child, and dukes are slowest of all. And grief makes fools of the cleverest of us. Lucius thought he had made a practical arrangement. He had no idea. He had just invited a quiet, determined woman to dismantle his world, one shuttered window at a time. He had hired a duchess. He had not yet understood that he had found a lifeline. The wedding was a quiet, perfunctory affair at a dusty parish church, attended by a handful of solicitors and a still furious Lady Tilson. Prudence wore a simple dress of dove gray, feeling less like a bride and more like a signatory to a complex legal document. Lucius stood beside her, a pillar of controlled composure. He spoke his vows in a low, clear voice, and when he slid the heavy gold band onto her finger, his touch was cool and impersonal. She was now the Duchess of Ravenshaw. The name felt like a costume she had not yet learned how to wear. Self-sufficient, the word for a horse that does not need to be fed. Returning to Ravenshaw House as its mistress was a surreal experience. The staff lined the hall, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, resentment. They were Mrs. Gable, the formidable housekeeper who had served the late Duchess since she was a girl, Thomas, the aging, mournful butler, and a dozen other faces, all watching her, waiting for her to fail. They saw a plain, penniless upstart who had somehow tricked their grieving master. Prudence did not try to win them over with false cheer or grand pronouncements. She simply met Mrs. Gable's stony gaze and said, "I am pleased to meet you, Mrs. Gable. I am sure I will have much to learn from you about the running of this house." It was the truth, and the simple, unadorned honesty of it seemed to momentarily wrong-foot the housekeeper. Her first act as Duchess was not to redecorate or to plan a ball. It was to walk through the house, from the dusty attics to the cold, damp cellars, and open the curtains. One by one she untied the heavy velvet drapes and let the pale London sunlight spill into the rooms. The staff watched her, as if she were committing an act of sacrilege. The house had been dark since the late Duchess's passing, a sealed monument to her memory. "The Dusta Mrs. Axie," Gable murmured, horrified, as a sunbeam illuminated a thick, dancing cloud of it. Yes," Prudence said calmly. We will need to attend to that." She did not win them by force or charm. She won them by staying, by her patient, undramatic consistency, where every predecessor had fled. Her true domain was the nursery. The room was still Cecilia's silent kingdom. Prudence did not try to invade it. She would simply bring a book and sit in a chair by the window, reading quietly for an hour each morning. She did not speak to Cecily, unless it was to say a gentle "a good morning" or a good night. She did not ask questions. She did not demand a response. She simply shared the silence with her. One afternoon, she found a small, leather-bound book tucked away in a drawer. It was a collection of lullabies, the pages worn and soft. On the flyleaf, in elegant, feminine script, was the name A. Eleonora, the late Duchess. Prudence sat in her usual chair and, without looking at Cecily, began to hum one of the tunes. Cecily, who was lining up a row of wooden soldiers on the floor, went utterly still. Her small hands froze over the toys. She did not look up, but Prudence could feel the childish attention fixed on her, a taut, vibrating wire in the quiet room. She finished the melody and closed the book. She did not press. Lucius watched all of this from a distance. He would find reasons to be in the hall when she was with Cecily. He would stand in the doorway of the library, watching her go over the household accounts, her brow furrowed in concentration. She had a mind for numbers, a sharp, practical intelligence that saw through the muddled ledgers Mrs. Gable had kept. She was saving him a small fortune, but that was not what held his attention. He saw her kindness to the staffa, the way she noticed a kitchen maid's chapped hands and quietly arranged for a pot of soothing balm to be sent down, the way she took the time to ask Thomas about his ailing wife. These were small, quiet acts of care, performed when she believed no one of consequence was watching. He was a man who noticed things, and he was noticing everything about her. He was noticing the way the sunlight caught the reddish glints in her brown hair, the quiet competence of her hands, the way she never raised her voice but could still a room with a single steady look. He had made a bargain for a duchess. He was beginning to suspect he had gotten something far more valuable and far more dangerous. One evening, he found her in the library, a stack of architectural drawings spread across the vast mahogany desk. What is this?" he asked, his voice startling her. Your Grace Lucius," she corrected herself. Was just looking at the plans for the West Wing. "These drawing rooms, they have not been used in years." No," he said. Eleonora found them too large. Too formal. "Ah, they are large," Prudence agreed. Large enough to hold a conversation." She looked up at him, her expression earnest. This house is silent. This city is full of noise. What if we could create something in between? A place for ideas, for art, for music, for poetry. Not a ball, not a rout, a salon, a place where people come to talk, to listen. He stared at her. The idea was radical. His late wife's entertainments had been traditional, glittering affairs. This was intellectual, bohemian almost. It was a risk. A huge one. A society will not understand it, he said, flatly. They will mock it. They will mock you. That them, she said simply. Perhaps the people who matter will understand. Perhaps this house needs to hear voices again. Perhaps your daughter needs to know that life can be full of passion and argument and art, not just a silence. He saw the passion in her own eyes, the fervent belief in her idea. He had married her to be a quiet placeholder, a respectable warden for his grief. She was proposing to throw open the doors and invite the entire, messy, vibrant world inside. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was in a conversation with his solicitor a few days later that the words slipped out. They were discussing the trust, the upcoming review, the precariousness of his position with regard to Cecily. The new Duchess has ambitions for the house. His solicitor, Mr. Fletcher, noted cautiously. A salon, I hear. Lucius looked out the window at the endless gray rain. He thought of Prudence, of her quiet determination, of the wolves of society who would circle, smelling weakness, smelling novelty they could destroy. A wave of weary, protective cynicism washed over him. He was afraid for her, and it angered him. Ada's a noble idea, he said. His voice clipped and harsh. But she won't survive this season. They tear her apart. He did not know that Lady Honoria Vane was in the adjoining room, ostensibly arranging flowers. Her ear pressed to the door. She heard his words, and a slow, triumphant smile spread across her face. Even the Duke knew his little brown mouse of a wife was doomed. And she, Honoria, would be the one to set the trap. The breakthrough with Cecily came on a Tuesday. Prudence had brought a small vase of early snowdrops into the nursery and set them on the windowsill. She was watering them when a tiny voice, thin from disuse, spoke from behind her. There, White. Prudence's heart leaped. She turned slowly. Cecily was standing by the toy chest, looking at the flowers. Her face was pale, her expression uncertain, as if she had just performed a dangerous magical trick. Prudence gave her a small, calm smile. Yes, they are. They're called snowdrops. They're one of the first flowers to come up after the winter. As Cecily considered this, she took a hesitant step closer. Mama liked white flowers. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a piece of memory, offered up like a fragile gift. That as a lovely thing to remember, Prudence said gently. Did she have a favorite? Cecily shook her head, a flicker of anxiety crossing her face. The door had opened, but only a crack. She retreated back to her toys, and the silence fell again. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was a silence with a word in it, a beginning. That evening, Prudence told Lucius. They were in the library, a rare fire crackling in the grate. She spoke to me today. He looked up from his papers, his face guarded. What did she say? She told me her mother liked white flowers. Lucius put down his pen. He stared into the fire, his expression unreadable. Eleonora loved roses, white ones. She had a whole garden of them at the country estate. After she died, I had them all torn out. I couldn't bear to look at them. He spoke the words in a low, flat monotone, as if reciting a page from a book. It was the most he had ever said about his late wife. A confession of a pain so deep it had turned to destruction. A grief can make us cruel to beautiful things, Prudence said softly. He looked at her then and his eyes were raw. "I did not expect," he began, his voice rough. And then he stopped. He seemed to be wrestling with himself. "I am glad she spoke to you." It was a small thing, but it felt momentous. A shared confidence. A crack in the armor of his solitude. The salon was another matter. Against all of Lucius's grim predictions and to the astonishment of London society, it was a success. Prudence did not issue gilt-edged invitations. She sent simple handwritten notes to poets who published in shabby journals, to painters who couldn't afford their own studios, to radical thinkers who wrote pamphlets, and to a handful of curious, intelligent aristocrats who were bored with the endless cycle of balls and card parties. The first evening, the vast west drawing-room was sparsely populated. The attendees eyed each other with suspicion. But Prudence moved among them, a calm center in the nervous energy. She didn't try to lead conversations. She started them. She asked a fiery young poet about his influences. She introduced a shy astronomer to a notoriously argumentative philosopher. She served simple food and good wine, and she let them talk, and they did. The room filled with a sound that had been absent from Ravenshaw House for over a year. The passionate, chaotic, glorious noise of human connection. By the third salon, it was the most talked-about event in London. To be invited to the Duchess of Ravenshaw's evenings was to be marked as someone of interest, of intellect. The house, that had been a tomb, was now a crucible of ideas. It was alive. Lucius would stand in the doorway watching. He saw Prudence not as a duchess but as a conductor, drawing out the music in each of her guests. She was not beautiful in the way Clara was. Her worth was not in the perfection of her face, but in the quality of her attention. When she listened to someone, she made them feel as if they were the only person in the world. He found himself drawn to the light she created, standing closer each time, a moth inching toward a flame he both feared and desperately wanted. He saw the change in his daughter, too. Cecily was still quiet, but she would now sit on the top step of the stairs, listening to the murmur of voices and the occasional burst of laughter from below. The house's new heartbeat was slowly restarting her own. Of course, not everyone was pleased. Lady Honoria Vane attended each salon, her face a mask of polite disapproval. She saw Prudence's success not as a miracle, but as an affront. This plain, penniless creature was succeeding where she had failed. She was erasing Eleanor's memory with this cacophony of commoners and radicals. She saw the way Lucius looked at his new wife, with a dawning admiration that terrified her. She had been the custodian of his grief for so long. She could not bear to see him heal without her. The crime was that she had been chosen first. Honoria decided it was time to act. Her victory, she knew, must be public. It must be absolute. It must destroy Prudence so completely that Lucius would have no choice but to turn back to her, to the familiar comfort of their shared mourning. She spent weeks laying her trap, using her considerable fortune to hire investigators to dig into the Alloway family's past. Prudence's father had not just been a failed scholar, he had been a compulsive gambler, leaving a trail of ruin and dishonor. It was easy to procure a sample of his handwriting, easy to commission a forgery. The chosen evening was the salon meant to celebrate the publication of a new collection of poetry by the fiery young man Prudence had first championed. The rooms were packed, the atmosphere was electric. Prudence, dressed in a simple gown of deep blue that brought out the warmth in her eyes, was radiant. She was happy. Lucius stood near her, no longer hovering in the doorway, but a participant, drawn into a debate about Italian art with a visiting painter. He caught her eye across the room and gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod of approval, of pride. It was then that Honoria made her move. My dear Duchess," she said, her voice carrying across a sudden lull in the conversation. "I have just received the most curious piece of correspondence. It seems to have been misdirected to me, but I believe it concerns you. Ox." She held up a letter. The room quieted. All eyes turned to them. "It appears to be from your late father," Honoria continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy, or rather a demand for payment on a debt he incurred, a rather staggering one, I am afraid. To a moneylender of the most unsavory reputation. She unfolded the letter. "It seems your father, before his death, signed a note pledging your hand in marriage to this moneylender's son to settle the debt. Or, failing that, for you to work off the sum in servitude." A collective gasp went through the room. It was a lie, a grotesque fabrication, but it was a brilliant one. It painted Prudence not as an intellectual hostess, but as a desperate, indebted creature who had entrapped the Duke to escape a fate worse than death. It reframed her entire story into one of sordid desperation. The letter suggests," Honoria said, delivering the killing blow, that the Duca's generous settlement upon you was just enough to buy your freedom from this prior arrangement. How fortunate for you, A. The silence that followed was absolute. The warmth, the laughter, the life it, all bled out of the room in an instant. Prudence stood frozen, the blood draining from her face. She felt hundreds of eyes on her, their curiosity curdling into suspicion and contempt. The poets, the artists, the thinkers say, they were all part of society, and society loved nothing more than a spectacular fall from grace. She wannot survive this season. The Duca's words echoed in her mind a cold, prophetic blow. He had known this would happen. He had predicted her ruin. Honoria smiled, a thin, cruel slash of victory. She had won. The upstart Duchess was exposed. Lucius moved to Perdance's side. His face was a thundercloud. Honoria," he said, his voice dangerously low. You have made a grave mistake." Of I, Lucius?" she countered, her voice triumphant. Or have I simply revealed the truth? You were too blinded by Hitia to see." The guests began to melt away, murmuring excuses, eager to escape the scene of the execution, and to be the first to spread the news. The room emptied with shocking speed. Soon, only Lucius, Prudence, and Honoria remained standing in the wreckage of the evening. Prudence could not look at him. She felt a shame so profound it was like a physical illness. He had given her his name, his trust, and she had brought this scandal crashing down upon his house. Prudence," he said, his voice urgent. He reached for her, but she flinched away. "Adona," she whispered. Please." She turned and fled, up the grand staircase to the sanctuary of her rooms, the sound of Honoria's soft, victorious laughter following her all the way. She locked the door, leaning against it, her body trembling. The beautiful, vibrant house she had started to build had been reduced to rubble in a single, devastating moment. The frost was creeping back over the windows, thicker and colder than ever before. Lucius stood in the empty drawing room, the forged letter lying on the floor like a dead leaf. He looked at Honoria, and the cold fury in his eyes was something she had never seen before. Get out of my house," he said, each word a chip of ice. Lucius, be reasonable. On now." She left, still flushed with her victory, not yet realizing that the weapon she had used had a fatal flaw. It was aimed at Prudence, but it had struck Lucius, and he was a man who did not tolerate attacks on what was his. He went to the door of Perdance's room and knocked softly. Prudence." "Let me in." There was no answer. "I know it is a lie," he said, his voice low and urgent against the wood of the door. "I know her. I know you. We will fix this." A silence. He sighed, a sound of profound frustration, and something else, fear. He rested his forehead against the door. "Oh, when I made my bargain, I did not account for this," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "I did not account for how much I would care whether you succeeded, or how much it would hurt when you were hurt." It was a half-confession, ragged and torn from him by the crisis. Inside, Prudence heard every word. She sank to the floor, her face in her hands, and wept. Not for the humiliation, not for the salon, but for the terrible, fragile hope his words ignited in her shattered heart. The days that followed were a quiet, cold hell. The house was silent again, the staff moving like ghosts, their eyes full of pity. Prudence did not leave her rooms. She could not face the whispers, the stares. She had failed. She had proven him right. She had not survived the season. Lucius, however, was a man galvanized. The attack on Prudence had shattered the last of his lethargic grief. He worked with a cold, swift fury, dispatching agents, calling in favors, his mind as sharp and analytical as a surgeon's scalpel. He was the Duke of Ravenshaw, and he had forgotten, in the fog of his mourning, what that meant. It meant power, and he would use all of it to protect her. He found the forger, a nervous little man in a back-alley print shop, who confessed instantly when faced with the Duca's icy wrath. He traced the payments back to Honoria's personal accounts. He gathered affidavits. He built his case with the same methodical precision Prudence had used on his household ledgers. While he worked, Prudence found an unlikely ally. One morning, there was a soft knock on her door. It was Cecily. The child stood there, clutching the silver-backed hairbrush. She said nothing, but she held it out to Prudence. It was an offering, an invitation. Prudence let her in. Cecily climbed onto the chaise lounge and sat, watching her. For the first time, Prudence saw not just a grieving child, but a small person of immense, quiet strength. A survivor, like her. Your Aunt Honoria. She is not a kind person, Prudence said softly, breaking the silence. Cecily looked down at her hands. She told me Mama went to heaven because I was too loud. She whispered the words, a secret she had held like a hot coal in her heart. She said. My laughter made her head hurt, and that is why she got sick. That I sang her to death, of the specific wound. The poison administered drop by drop. Prudence's heart broke for her. She went to the child and knelt before her, taking her small hands. Cecily, look at me. She said gently. Ah, that is the cruelest lie I have ever heard. Your mother loved your laughter. She loved your songs. A mother's greatest joy is the sound of her happy child. Sickness is just a sickness. It is no one's fault. It is certainly not the fault of a little girl with a beautiful voice. Tears welled in Cecilia's eyes and spilled down her cheeks. They were the first tears Prudence had ever seen her cry. She pulled the child into her arms and held her tight as a year of silent, misplaced guilt poured out of her. In healing the child, Prudence felt a sliver of her own strength returning. Honoria had tried to poison them both with lies. But the truth, she was beginning to understand, was the only antidote. A week after the disastrous salon, Lucius came to her. His face was grim but determined. I am hosting a reception tomorrow night, he announced. I have invited everyone, the entire city. You must be there. No, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I can't. You can, he insisted, his gaze locking with hers. You will stand by my side. You are the Duchess of Ravenshaw. It is time we reminded them what that means. He saw the fear in her eyes and his expression softened. I will not let you fall, Prudence. I promise. The next evening, the grand ballroom of Ravenshaw House, which had not been used since before the late Duchess's illness, was blazing with light. It was filled to capacity. The air crackled with anticipation and malice. Everyone had come to witness the final, public execution of the upstart Duchess. Prudence descended the main staircase on Lucius's arm. She wore the deep blue gown again, a quiet act of defiance. Her head was held high, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Every eye was on her, cold and judgmental. She felt Luciosa's hand tighten on her arm, a small, steady pressure of support. Lady Honoria was holding court near the fireplace, triumphant and radiant. She watched them approach, a predatory smile on her lips. Lucius led Prudence to the center of the room. He tapped a glass for silence. The murmuring died away instantly. Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice calm and carrying to every corner of the room. "I have invited you here tonight to correct a slander. Last week in this house, a vicious lie was told to deliberately and maliciously ruin the reputation of my wife." A shocked murmur went through the crowd. Honoria's smile faltered. "I have here," Lucius continued, holding up a sheaf of papers, "a sworn confession from the man who forged the letter Lady Honoria so helpfully brought to our attention. I also have bank records showing the payments he received from her account. The entire story was a fabrication, designed to humiliate a woman whose grace and intelligence my sister-in-law found threatening. He let the words land. The mood in the room shifted, the crowd turning as one to stare at Honoria, who had gone pale as death. The publica's hunger for scandal was turning on a new victim, but the true vindication came from an entirely unexpected quarter. A small figure appeared at the top of the staircase. It was Cecily. Dressed in her nightgown, she walked slowly down the stairs, her eyes fixed on Prudence. The entire ballroom held its breath. She walked straight through the crowd which parted for her, as if she were royalty. She went to Prudence, ignoring her father, ignoring the hundreds of staring faces, and took her hand. Then she turned to face Lady Honoria. Her voice was not a whisper. It was as clear and ringing as a silver bell. "An Aunt Honoria told me my laughter made Mama die," she said, her small face resolute. "She told me I was poison." The crowd gasped. Prudence taught me it was a lie. She taught me to sing again." It was the most devastating testimony imaginable. It was not about forgery or money. It was about a cruelty so profound it was almost unthinkable. Honoria was undone. Not by law, not by social decree, but by the simple, unassailable truth spoken by a child. She had tried to break the silence in the room was her verdict, a room that no longer believed her. Lucius put a protective arm around Prudence and Cecily, gathering them close. He looked out at the sea of faces, his expression one of fierce, undeniable ownership. This is my family," he declared, his voice thick with emotion. My wife and my daughter. Their honor is my honor. Anyone who questions that will answer to me." It was the first declaration of belonging. The man publicly defending and claiming her. Then Prudence, feeling a surge of strength she had never known, stepped forward. She looked directly at Honoria, her gaze not angry but steady and clear. "You wish to be the custodian of this family's grief," she said, her voice quiet but firm. But grief is not a possession. And this is not your house anymore. You lost that authority the moment you chose cruelty over love." The second declaration. The heroine claiming her own place. Cecily squeezed her hand, a silent, powerful affirmation. The third. Honoria stood there, exposed and alone in a circle of silence. She turned and fled the room, not with a dramatic flourish, but with the hurried, desperate scramble of someone who has just become irrelevant. The house was quiet. The guests had departed, their minds reeling. The fire in the library crackled, casting a warm, dancing light on the walls. Cecily was asleep, tucked into her bed, the silver-backed brush on her nightstand. Lucius stood by the fireplace, a glass of brandy in his hand. Prudence watched him from the doorway. The battle was over. They had won. But a chasm of unspoken things still lay between them. "Has she really told Cecily that?" he asked, his voice rough with disbelief and rage. Prudence said, children believe what they are told by the people who are supposed to love them." He turned to face her, his eyes dark with a pain that had nothing to do with his late wife. It was the pain of his own failure. I should have seen it. I should have protected her. You were grieving, she said softly. You couldn't see anything clearly. He set the glass down with a thud. That is no excuse. He crossed the room to her in 3 long strides. He stopped before her, his hands clenched at his sides. The bargain was a lie. Prudence, a convenient frame for what I was too cowardly to admit. I was drowning. This house was a tomb, and I was letting it drag me and my daughter down into the dark. I told myself I needed a duchess, a hostess. What I needed was to not be so terribly alone. His voice was raw, stripped of all ducal authority. It was just the voice of a man, confessing his own profound loneliness. You came into this cold, dead place and you were patient. You were kind. You opened the curtains. You taught my daughter that her voice was a gift, not a curse. You brought this house back to life. You brought me back to life. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. I love you, Prudence. Not because you are useful, not because you are my duchess, but because you are the most courageous and honest and good person I have ever known. Hey. Her heart felt like it would burst. The words were everything she had never dared to hope for. But the old habit of being unwanted, of being only a means to an end, died hard. Do not say it if it is only gratitude, she whispered, her voice trembling. For Cecily, for the house. I couldn't bear that gratitude. He gave a short, harsh laugh. I am grateful. But this, he leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. This is not gratitude. When I saw you standing there, with Honoria's lies raining down on you, the only thing I could think was that I would burn the entire city to the ground to protect you. When you fled from me, it felt like the world had ended. That is not gratitude, Prudence. I believe that is love. P kissed her, then it was not a practiced, polished kiss. It was clumsy and desperate and deeply, profoundly true. It was a kiss of confession, of relief, of a beginning. She wrapped her arms around his neck, kissing him back, pouring all of her own unspoken hope and fear and burgeoning love into it. The bargain was null and void. The contract had been replaced by something real and alive and beautifully, terrifyingly new. 6 months later, the Frost was a distant memory. Ravenshaw House was the beating heart of London. The salons were more popular than ever, the conversations louder, the laughter richer. The West drawing rooms were always filled with light and people, and the scent of fresh flowers and hot coffee. The house was no longer holding its breath. It was singing. The portrait of Eleonora, the late Duchess, still hung in the main hall. Prudence often paused before it. She had been a beautiful woman, with a sad, gentle smile. Prudence had placed a small vase of white roses on the table beneath it. She had not replaced her. She had simply made room for the living alongside the memory of the dead. One evening, Prudence stood by the library window, looking out at the carriages arriving for that night at Salon. The city lights glittered like a scattered handful of diamonds. She felt a warmth at her back, and turned to see Lucius standing there, his arms wrapping around her waist. He rested his chin on her shoulder, and they stood in comfortable silence, watching the world they had built together. A patter of small feet announced the arrival of their daughter. Cecily, dressed in her nightgown, ran into the room, her face bright with excitement. She held up a drawing. It was a picture of the 3 of them, standing in front of the house. They were all holding hands, and they were all smiling. "Aida's for you," she said, handing it to Prudence. "Aida's beautiful, my love," Prudence said, her heart full. Cecily hugged her tight, then hugged her father. She looked up at Prudence, her dark eyes, so like her father's, full of a simple, uncomplicated love. "A good night, Mama," she said, before turning and scampering back up to bed. "Mama?" The words settled into Prudence's heart, a final, perfect piece clicking into place. Lucius held her tighter, his own emotions too deep for words. He kissed the top of her head. She had come to this house as part of a bargain, a woman the world had dismissed, a woman even he had believed would not survive. She had walked into a fortress of grief and had, with nothing more than her quiet courage and unwavering patience, turned it into a home. She had not just survived, she had not just triumphed. She had become the woman who stayed. What a journey of quiet strength and earned love. Do you believe true change comes from grand gestures or from small, patient acts of kindness like the ones Prudence showed? Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what part of her story touched you the most. If you enjoyed this tale, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel for more stories of love, courage, and unexpected happily ever afters. We love reading your thoughts and sharing these moments with you. We'll have another story for you very soon.